I guess it's about that time. Time for another deep dive into the English language library of the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega CD, and 32X. Hi, I'm your host Dave, and this is Zilog and Moto, the mostly weekly YouTube channel where in every episode I take a look at least one game, sometimes more if it's a special video, from Sega's 8 and 16-bit era. Relax and enjoy as I go over the history of the game, where it came from, who made it, that sort of thing. And then take a look at the actual package for said game to get an idea of what it looked like on store shelves, or as you were opening it to get ready to play 30 years ago. And then finally a review of the game, complete with footage of the game captured from original hardware. In most cases anyway. Light gun games I still have to emulate, and I haven't quite figured out what I'm going to do for the Master System 3D library, but they will be covered in some fashion. Maybe I'll use one of them to celebrate the 5th anniversary of the channel in a year and a half. Who knows? If that sounds interesting to you, I'd ask that you think about subscribing, as the more people that subscribe allow the channel to be seen by a bigger audience, and it will help you know when new videos get posted, just in case I get off schedule, which definitely happens more than I'd care to admit. Also, definitely feel free to comment as well. I do genuinely enjoy seeing the comments on the videos, and reading those is usually a lot more pleasurable than when I accidentally wade into a Kojima thread on Twitter and have the temerity to post something logical. I swear, I thought I was taking crazy pills. Half the people jumped my ass because it was supposedly a joke post that I took too seriously, and then the other half the people that weren't in on the joke got all over me because I didn't hate Konami enough or some other nonsense. Friends, just don't let friends post in Kojima threads. This has been a public service announcement from Zilog and Moto. Oh, enough about all that. Let's get to this week's video, which is for a game that I'm almost positive I will not see this weekend, or probably last weekend since you'll be watching this video afterwards. Anyway, I'm pretty sure that as great of a selection of retro games that will be at the Midwest Gaming Classic in Milwaukee will be, this will not be a game that you will find there, not necessarily due to its rarity, because honestly it's not that rare, it goes for about $50 complete right now, but because it was exclusive to PAL regions and Korea. And my experience has been with MGC, you'll see a lot of Japanese imports, but European imports, not so much. And that game is Forgotten Worlds for the Master System. If you're a longtime viewer of the channel, you might remember that I already reviewed the Genesis version of Forgotten Worlds back in episode 55, and to this day, it's one of my favorite games on a console, as Sega was able to reproduce an awesome version of the Capcom arcade classic very early on in the Genesis lifespan, as it's one of the first 15 or so games to appear on the Genesis after the console's launch in August of 1989. This Master System version actually came out much later than the Genesis version, which is a little weird to think about it being an 8-bit title instead of a 16-bit title, but it didn't appear until 2 years later in July of 1991, partially explaining why it didn't appear in the US, as the Master System was all but dead in the US at that point. So, how does the Master System version hold up in comparison to the Genesis version that I love so much, or the arcade original? Well, I'm pretty curious myself, but first, a look at the package.
And here's my copy of Forgotten Worlds for the Master System, and it's in pretty good shape. The actual clamshell is held up well, hang tab intact at the top, and there's just some very minor scratching on the outside. The inner cover is where there's a little bit of roughness. If you'll notice at the bottom, it looks like it slid out a bit, so you've got some edge wear. But other than that, it's held up well, and the manual and cartridge look good too, as we'll see in a minute. Fans of the Genesis version, or perhaps the arcade game, will immediately notice that something is a bit off here with this cover. Just to refresh your memory, here's the Genesis cover, and you'll see that it features both the red and blue Nameless Warrior Super Soldiers for Player 1 and Player 2, but the Master System version only has one, the soldier on the right. This is due to the fact that one of the concessions to get the game onto the Master System was to remove two-player mode, so that it's now only a one-player shoot-'em-up. But if you look a bit closer, it appears that they didn't simply cut one of the characters, they took both characters and amalgamated them together for a new super soldier. For this new character, their outfit is purple, which is of course a mix of red and blue, And while the character has the red super soldier's pose and positioning, and sunglasses for that matter, the head has been switched to the blue blonde super soldier. Of course, none of this really matters, but I do appreciate how whoever came up with this cover at least put a little bit of thought into it. Flipping over the spine real quick, and you have a pretty boring Forgotten Worlds in orange block text. I'm not real sure what's going on there, but I do find it interesting that Sega had gotten to the point where they weren't just using the traditional black text names on the spine, and were moving to instead use the game logos and art, but they didn't do that here. I could see that as a callback to the Genesis spine, which has the name in a similar orange font, but I don't know, it just looks funny to me, especially when it's sitting next to other Master System games on the shelf. Over to the back, and we've got a pretty nice layout here with some elements of classic Master System design at the bottom, mentioning the number of rounds and that it's a one-player game. On the left are 4 good quality screenshots from the game that have a decent variety to them, and make the game look pretty good. And then on the right is that block logo again, and then flavor text in 6 different languages below, and like usual, I hope you've got a magnifying glass handy. The text itself is fine and gets across what's going on in the game briefly, although it neglects to mention how you'll be attempting to face the brutal alien fiends, and I don't know, this line about its rightful owners, the human beings, just sounds odd. Why wouldn't you just say humans? Opening up the case, and the cartridge looks beautiful with a pristine label, and the manual is in great shape as well. You can immediately see that this is a first-party Sega manual instead of a third-party manual, due to how the languages are broken up with 3 per page. The manual has lots of details about the game, including a breakdown of every level, and tips about what to do and how to make your way through. Beyond that, I'm really impressed with how many screenshots or graphics are on each page. Some pages have screenshots from the game, and then others showcase the various icons in the game for the items that you can pick up or purchase from the shop, and without even playing the game, I'm a little blown away by the fact that they appear to have tried to include as much from the original game as they could. Hopefully that's a good sign for the review section. Okay, that's the package. Let's get to the game and see just how well Sega was able to readapt this game for their 8-bit powerhouse. Before I get too into the review, I alluded earlier to the fact that even though Forgotten Worlds for the Master System isn't too rare a game in the grand scheme of things, that I still knew that I wouldn't be seeing it at the Midwest Gaming Classic. As I'd posted on Twitter cryptically about a special idea that I had for the video, where I would go up to various luminaries in the retro community that were attending, hand them the game, and then ask them if they'd ever seen it, and if so, where. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to pull that off, maybe next time. But it does go back to one of the reasons why I do this channel, and that's namely to get information about these games out there, as even as a decent-sized show like MGC, you won't find US Master System games, much less half the library that didn't make it over here. Seriously, other than one booth that had a decent selection of early area Master System titles in a glass case, and a random boxed light phaser that was sold right before I got to it, you'd be hard-pressed to find any representation of the console on the floor. Or maybe I just missed out by not being there Friday night, who knows. Okay, now that tangent is out of the way, let's talk about Forgotten Worlds. Forgotten Worlds started out life as a Capcom arcade machine that was originally released in the arcades in May of 1988. The easiest way to describe the game is that it's a horizontal shooter, although in the arcade version, there are a few levels that have vertical movement as well, without switching to a Tate graphics mode. Forgotten Worlds was the first game to appear on Capcom's CPS-1 arcade platform in the arcades, but even though it uses that common platform, it's not a widespread machine due to the fact that it utilizes a very unusual control scheme. It works by having a stick to move your nameless warrior around on the screen, and then also having a rotating button, which can be rotated clockwise and counterclockwise as needed to aim your weapons at the various enemies and bosses. Think of it as a mashup of a twin-stick shooter and a standard shooter. Obviously, there's no way to exactly replicate that type of special control scheme at home. For the Genesis version, since the original Genesis pad had 3 buttons, you ended up with 1 button to rotate left, 1 to rotate right, and then 1 to shoot. And yes, I know I'm simplifying that a bit. The TurboGrafx port uses a similar 3-button scheme, and they even released a special 3-button controller for the console in Japan, so that users didn't have to use the run button as one of the 3. But what about the Master System, since the controller famously only has 2 buttons, without even menu buttons to be used as an alternate? Well, it's actually quite simple. Your nameless super soldier apparently has a hell of a trigger finger because auto-fire is turned on, and one button is used for spinning clockwise with the other for counterclockwise. There's also a special attack that can be used by hitting both buttons, but like in beat-em-ups, you can only use this if your character has enough energy to pull it off. I can see where maybe some people wouldn't like the presence of auto-fire, maybe they feel it removes some of the skill from the game, but I think it's a great solution to the problem, and the game still ends up feeling like Forgotten Worlds. Along with having one less button for the control scheme, there were some other cuts, or maybe I should say adjustments, to make the game fit on the Master System. You may have noticed when I was looking at the back of the package that in the round section it said 5, and yes, that's accurate. The game has 5 levels, down from 7 in the Genesis version and 9 in the arcade version. So, as you can imagine, a significant portion of the game has been removed, especially if you're comparing it to that original arcade cabinet instead of just the Genesis port. However, even with this being an extremely scaled down version of the game, it still feels like Forgotten Worlds, and retains enough elements from the Genesis version to where it still seems familiar and not just some shooter that shares the name Forgotten Worlds and not much else. This was a pleasant surprise, as even though I've seen the Master System do some impressive things over the last 3.5 years or so of doing the channel, high-action arcade shooters isn't something that I would say is its strong suit. Sega dealt with this situation in a very smart way, and focused on keeping the level structures at least similar to what people were used to if they'd played the game on the Genesis. The game starts out with a familiar first level, with its cold dark sky and reptilian enemies, followed by the mechanical section with its giant gears, steam pipes, and then eventual corpulent boss that attacks by throwing junk at you. The second level begins with you outside again before getting to a diagonally scrolling section with plenty of turrets, that's followed by large pillars that you have to blast out of your way to proceed and to gain money. This is where the first major merging of content takes place, as the dragon boss you might be expecting has been replaced with the Iron Soldier boss, originally from the next level, with its giant indestructible arms and flame-throwing eyes. After this, the third level contains the Egyptian-themed multi-branch path level that was originally the 4th Genesis level, complete with an end showdown with the Sphinx. The 4th Master System level is unique, as it was created specifically for this version, but it plays well and features an interesting crab boss. And then finally, the last level is an amalgamation of the 6th and 7th Genesis levels, starting out in the cloud realm above the planet before transitioning to the final showdown in the lone vertical scrolling level in this version of the game. While I'm impressed with all that aforementioned content that they were able to keep in the game, I will admit that the adventure presented, which was never long to begin with, is definitely on the short side, and an easy run through the game will only take about 20 minutes. But something that hopefully you got out of those level descriptions, and the captured footage from the game you've been currently watching of course, is the sheer variety of the experience that has always been a strength of the game, and has been carried over to this version. Due to the way the levels were condensed and cut, none of the 5 levels here resemble one another, and each has its own unique feel with a great variety of backgrounds, enemies, and bosses. This variety also applies to the game's weapon and power-up system, which remains intact and gives you plenty of ways to play through the game should you so choose, with some weapons certainly being more useful than others, and with a limited amount of money obtained in the levels, the same strategy of what items to buy when still applies, and can be the difference between a successful run or a quick death. All of these things added up to make a successful port of the game to the Master System, to be sure. But just because the game feels like and resembles the Genesis version of Forgotten Worlds, there's still some fine details to discuss. For instance, the graphics and sound. When Forgotten Worlds was ported to the Genesis, there was significant detail lost. The Genesis was a decent piece of hardware for 1989, but it simply wasn't as powerful as a CPS-1 board, so when cramming the game into a 4 megabit cartridge, some cuts were going to have to be made, but as I discussed in the review of the Genesis version, I think they still created a great looking game for its time. The Master System version, this time only weighing in at 2 megabits, is having to fight an even more difficult battle. But even with only half the storage and a fraction of the processing power, I think Forgotten Worlds holds up really well. Sure, lots of finer detail is missing, with plenty of less detailed backgrounds and smaller sprites, but it doesn't look bad on the surface. Where the graphics really take a hit is with the actual performance of the game. Like many shooters of the era, when too much is happening on screen at once, slowdown can occur, sometimes creating a jerky feel as the game vacillates based on how many things are flying around. Along with the showdown, there's some flickering as well that pops up at times, with certain weapons causing more of an issue than others due to the amount of sprites that get displayed on the same line. I also experienced some weird graphical glitching with the backgrounds at times, but this appeared to be more of a random thing and not something that a player should expect every time they play. None of that is too unexpected in shooters from the era, however, and it was minimal enough that it didn't detract from my enjoyment of the game. Overall, the game looks solid, and some of the more iconic moments of the game, like the static cutscenes and the Iron Soldier and final bosses, are well represented. While I was happy with the job that was done on the graphics engine for the game, the sound I wasn't quite as impressed by. The sound effects in the game are adequate and about what you would expect from the Master System in a shooter, namely a lot of white noise explosions and pings. Where I was let down is the soundtrack, and perhaps it's because I was coming off a previous review in Back to the Future 3, where literally the best part of the game was the soundtrack, but there's a large portion of music in Forgotten Worlds that honestly just sounds like it was some guy screwing around on the synthesizer with no real rhyme or reason as to what they were doing. Some of the tracks are decent, like the intro track and the shop track and some of the boss music, but the general level background music tracks are pretty bad. Here, I'll shut up for a bit so you can hear what I'm referring to. Like I said, it's pretty rough. All in all, I'm glad Forgotten Worlds on the Master System exists, as it's one of my favorite shooters, and it's nice being able to have another platform to play it on. It's not perfect though, especially when taking the aforementioned music issues into consideration, and it does lose a bit of its luster by only being a one-player game. As a result, I'm giving Forgotten Worlds 3 stars. Purists need not apply, and if you already have the Genesis version, that's easily the superior experience, but fans of the game in general would probably take interest in that 4th level since it's exclusive to this version of the game. If you're looking for a solid arcade shooter for your Master System library, this is a good one to pick up and add to your collection.
And that was Forgotten Worlds for the Master System. In reviewing this game, and then looking back at the Genesis version, and then also comparing both to other versions that are out there, I kind of wish that the Genesis version didn't come out so early, so it could be closer to what, say, the TurboGrafx Super CD got. But I suppose if I really wanted an arcade-perfect version of the game, there's other avenues I could explore in 2022. Tune in next week as I go back to the Genesis for the first time in over a month. Wow, that's crazy, seeing as how half this library is Genesis and Mega Drive titles. But I guess that's just the way the schedule worked out. This game is yet another game that I know very little about, other than the fact that I remember seeing advertisements for it in comic books back in the day, and due to those advertisements, I always thought of this game as being a Game Boy game rather than a Genesis or Super Nintendo title. And yes, that's probably just as bad a sign as you think it is, but I haven't played it yet, so who knows, maybe you'll surprise me. Remember, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later.